Hello and welcome to another episode of No Free Lunch. I've talked about how we do not have markets because people interact. We didn't create the concept of a market so that people could interact. People just interact, humans act, and that results in what we call a market. Similarly, the great Friedrich Bastiat taught us that we do not have private property because we created laws for it. We have laws because there just is something called private property. There just is something called life and liberty as well. And once you accept the existence of life, liberty, and property, you then can create laws, social structures to defend such. Private property is not created by economics. Private property is the assumption of economics. Private property can be said to be the bedrock of a flourishing society. Throughout civilization, where there has been great respect for private property, there has been greater respect for human beings, for the idea of safety, for a well-being that permeates all aspects of societal living. But when it comes to the microeconomic aspect of this, the right for one to dispose of one's own property as they see fit, to steward property as they see fit, to make decisions around their own assets, this speaks to two different things that are incredibly important in this subject. The freedom of it, of course, is very important. People make rational decisions around their own private property when they are just simply holding the ball for somebody else. They're less inclined to care about it. They're more prone to fumble what is not really their own ball. But when people own things that they care for, they make better decisions, and that rationality and reason that God made human beings with comes into fray and leads to better results, better stewardship, better allocation of resources. This concept of an ownership society has great impact to economic and social well-being. However, there is a responsibility that comes with this. People with private property not only have the rights to the fruit that comes from trees they own, they not only have the right to profits from their own assets, things of that nature, all of which I think are vitally important. But then they have the responsibility of stewardship, of care, of wise decision-making. So this has two sides in this coin. We get the upside of owning assets and benefiting from what can come of this concept of an ownership dynamic. But the responsibility and burden for care, for stewardship, for cultivation, for responsibility plays as well. How can one be responsible for property they don't own? This subject is vital in striking at both aspects of the free and virtuous society. Private property speaks to freedom, but it requires virtue. It again is and must be the assumption of economics. We want our understanding of private property to lead to a better outcome in economics, in the kind of experience we have as a society. It's my belief that when we talk about meeting the needs of humanity and this whole concept of human flourishing that I care so much about, I believe it has to start with private property. That apart from a firm understanding of ownership, of stewardship, it really becomes very difficult to lead to the solutions that drive a greater economic experience. This has been incredibly true historically, and I'm going to make a couple points to try to bring that home. I want to start with a sequence of understandings, a logical framework that I learned from the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises that I think is sort of praxeologically, if you will, very useful in our understanding of where private property leads to the meeting of human needs. And the first point is that private property is obviously necessary for free exchange. That if you do not own the things that you are exchanging, you can't exchange them. A buyer has every right to believe they will own what they are buying, and he also has every assumption that the seller selling it to him owns it. The seller can only be receiving compensation for what he's selling if he in fact owns it. And so private property sits as the just tautological assumption of exchange, that before we begin exchanging goods and services and doing this whole thing that we call economic transaction, that we presuppose private property. Just as ethically, we presuppose private property when we say it's wrong to steal, economically, we presuppose private property before we begin exchanging. And those interactions and exchanges are what drive an economy and drive the production and consumption of goods and services. But then, if you're going to have free exchange, and this is where I want to get a bit more macroeconomic with you. If you're going to have free exchange, you then are going to have price discovery, okay? You have to have free exchange where people set a price. And price discovery is when I can look at what people bought and sold for and say, wow, okay, now I see what things cost. I get what the great Friedrich Hayek called signals of information. And so in this price discovery, we are seeing what might have gone into the setting of a price. We're seeing subjective value that consumers put on a product, how well they value it. We're seeing what may be true of a supply and demand characteristic. Why did prices go up? Well, maybe there was a big drop in supply of things like oil or agricultural commodities. We know that land is scarce. And so reflected in prices are a lot of informational realities that matter to us in the way that we transact and live our lives. So you have to have private property to get free exchange, and you have to have free exchange to get price discovery. But then from price discovery, this concept of economic calculation. I don't only get information in prices, I get information that now I'm using to calculate, to make decisions, to weigh risk and reward. We talk about economics having a huge component of risk-taking to it. But then, of course, what you do with that economic calculation is not merely academic, it leads to production. It leads to the things we're going to go make. So where did that private property bring us to in the end? It brought us to the meeting of the needs of humanity. Well, sometimes these things all happen instantaneously. Like there are certain elements, I don't think people have to go through a 5-pronged process to think about when they're thirsty and they want to take a drink to quench their thirst. But fundamentally, all of these things are at play. And it starts with private property. And private property is the assumption of economics. Because once you have private property, you're able to have these other processes that lead to this desired outcome. To the extent that some of this seems kind of obvious, I should point out that it doesn't seem obvious in the sphere of public policy. That once you get to the notion of central planning, you have interfered with the idea of private property. You presuppose a certain sense of collective ownership once you start looking for collective management of assets, collective decision-making. And so private property really works against the whole idea of central planning, because the more private property you have, the more private decision-making one may have. So there's rules and regulations, and there's room for disagreement as to how some of these things can cooperate in the ideal framework of social organization. But my point is that we see time and time again that property is best stewarded when there is an ownership society. And that people, let's use as an example, those that have a just guaranteed paycheck in retirement versus those that are responsible to invest their assets accordingly. So you had the advent of the 401k kind of replacing what had previously been the idea of a pension. But there was never a time where the returns on a pension fund were irrelevant. They were vital to getting to the end result. The difference was the person benefiting didn't have to care about the result. So there was this total ignoring of an economic reality as to how you got the necessary result out of something that the people involved didn't own. And now you have things like 401ks and IRAs that have created a much more investment conscious, investment savvy society. That's only one example. One of the great arguments people had for home ownership is that people cared more for property they owned than property they rented. And it was my big criticism before the financial crisis of us saying that we were creating a home ownership society by just constantly leveraging it up and nobody ever paying down the debt on the property. That actually private property assumed you were building equity, and so you were reducing debt on it, which made you want to care for your property more and then care for the neighborhood in which your property existed more. There's a logic to this that we all understand. And the thing that can most mess it up is central planning. And the reason for central planning being deficient when it comes to private property is twofold. The great knowledge problem that Friedrich Hayek talked about so eloquently, that the state actor, the central planner, is too time and place removed from individual decision-making to have the knowledge necessary. They don't have the time and place context to act efficiently. They don't have knowledge. Thomas Sowell has been brilliant at laying out how fundamentally those of us at a local, proximate level have more knowledge to make decisions about our businesses, our families, our economic transactions, et cetera. So not only does a central planner lack the knowledge to make decisions around private property, but they lack the incentive. And this is a whole nother episode that we've looked at in terms of incentives involved in economics being so important. Skin in the game. And I would add, and the great Nassim Taleb has done so much work on this, skin in the game does not only mean positively. That like we think of skin in the game like, oh, I get a bonus if I do better, so I have skin in the game. But that's halfway true. Real skin in the game means you hurt if you make a bad decision. There's a negative context to real skin in the game. Bonuses are only one directional, right? They don't take money from you, your employer. So yeah, there's some skin in the game because you do better with a bonus. But a skin in the game that can hurt if you make a bad decision and help if you make a good one, no central planner can ever have either dimension at play. So the knowledge and the incentive, the skin in the game, that exists where there is private property, and it can never exist in the context of central planning. Well, our special guest today is Ryan Anderson, the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Ryan is, in my mind, one of the foremost Christian intellectuals who has not only a deep understanding of economics, but a tremendous understanding of theology and political philosophy. He did his doctorate at Notre Dame, his undergrad at Princeton, and is as smart as anyone can be on these issues, a very articulate writer, speaker. I'm really honored to have my friend Ryan Anderson joining us on No Free Lunch. Ryan, welcome to No Free Lunch.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I want to start with a little talk about the concept of private property. I'm wondering if in our religious tradition, there's anything that would suggest that the concept of private property is problematic or unbiblical.
Well, I mean, it depends, I guess, what you mean by that. But to a certain extent, the biblical tradition takes private property for granted. It's almost like a presupposition. If you think about the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, right? Whether it's your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's house. I mean, like built into those commandments is already an implicit understanding that there is going to be property and it's going to be privately owned. And then the debate's going to be, what extent? To what extent should it be privately owned? What are the parameters? What are the boundaries? But the concept of private property, that there should be property that is properly yours, property that is properly mine, and that you and I have moral obligations both not to steal, but also not to covet, right? Not to be envious, desirous, et cetera, et cetera. That's, to my mind, built into the biblical narrative, the biblical commandments, biblical tradition. But simultaneously, so too is an understanding that we have certain duties in how we utilize our private property. I mean, think about what Jesus says about the widow who donates, the widow's mite, right? She gave out of her very needs, right? Even more than giving of excess wealth, she gave from, all that she had. And so that sacrifice is being, honored all the more. But think too, to my mind, a very, a passage that I think we should use as an examination of conscience, Matthew chapter 25, right? Where, Lord, Lord, when did we see you hungry and not give you food? Lord, Lord, when did we see you thirsty and not give you drink? And then Jesus says, whatever you didn't do to the least of these, you didn't do to me, right? And then, they'll be cast off into hell where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. So, I mean, like, Jesus is really clear there that, as property owners, private property owners, we also need to think about how we're using our wealth. Are we using it in ways that benefit the common good, that benefit the least among us, et cetera, et cetera? So I think the concept of private property is, built right into the biblical narrative. And so what you mean by, is it problematic? Only insofar as, it might place duties upon us that are problematic, right? But I think that comes with the concept. So I don't see it as, a problem in a bad way. It's more of it's an opportunity for virtue. It's an opportunity to love other people.
And it seems to me that those commandments to love people, the verses you talk about really tee up a very serious Christian obligation that stems from one's heart for voluntary charity. And that if we refer to the charitable component in a coercive context around private property, not only do I think we sort of undermine the meaning of private property, but we undermine the meaning of charity, to care for one another, the very good work that the woman did in that final mite, the Matthew 25 exhortation. It seems to me we let people off the hook for what Jesus wanted of them if we simply coerce their private property away from them, as opposed to putting the burden, the right, the duty on them to have a heart of charity. Am I understanding the balance you're going for the right way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key part of it is that, I mean, this is the critique of the welfare state, right? I mean, the idea here is that the welfare state can crowd out good charity. So it's like, bad charity crowds out good charity. Welfare states can actually decrease the amount of civil society services that are helping those in need, and civil society services that actually do a better job of this. I think Marvin Olasky has written really quite profoundly about this, the tragedy of American compassion, for example. I think John Paul II, his encyclical Centesimus Annus, was very good on this. I think simultaneously, though, I mean, even someone, like Friedrich Hayek would say, there's no reason why a society as wealthy as ours shouldn't have a certain safety net, provided it doesn't distort markets. To give another example, Milton Friedman was the guy who really came up with the idea of school vouchers. Right? His thought was like, all right, if we're going to have collective obligations to the poor when it comes to education, rather than having government-run schools, which to my mind would be more like a welfare state, but here it's in education, much better to empower poor families with a voucher, and then they can choose what school they want to send their kids to. Right. And so I think it needs to be both and. We should think about what's the proper role of government vis-a-vis structuring private property markets, things like this, so that it does benefit the poor. And in my case, I think school choice is much better than government-run schools, both for the moral component, right? Government-run schools, they're teaching CRT, they're teaching gender ideology. Why should poor families be stuck there, right? We should have vouchers. But then I also think we should have charitable schools. I think Catholic schools are a great example of this, right? They were originally run by the church to help educate not only Catholics, but frequently, it's poor families who want to escape public schools who are attending Catholic schools, and they're not necessarily even Catholic, right? And I think that shows a both and approach. I want more of those families getting vouchers so that they can get out of public schools, go to schools that are being run by Catholics, other Christians, Jews, Mormons, et cetera, right? Let 1,000 flowers bloom there. And I think the end result will be better education, right? We'll best advance the common good of knowledge if we don't have the government monopoly on public education.
But I think it's a profoundly important way that you're framing this, that even the right of school choice is rooted in a private property right. That what Friedman was doing was taking a baseline that people had already been separated from their property tax dollars and funding an educational system, and he was finding a way to add more freedom and more choice to a structure that already existed, and that fundamentally the right of school choice comes out of this private property right. We have our tax dollars, let's direct it into a way that meets our family's educational goal, religious goal, civic goal. And so it seems really compatible and a very interesting application of the concept of private property.
And David, I mean, even going a step further, I would say it's really about parental rights and parental authority. I mean, so one of the great things about school choice is it empowers the parent to say, all right, these are my children. I have primary authority for their education. I might lack the material resources to send them to the school that I really want. A voucher empowers me to better fulfill my duties, right? It better respects my authority as the parent to say, what type of school do I want to send my kids to, right? And so I think the language of choice and of freedom even gets a deeper moral founding when you think about it now in terms of authority. Who has the baseline authority for the education of kids? Is it a government bureaucrat? Is it the state? Is it the parent? And one of the nice things about private property rights and parental rights is they can be mutually reinforcing, right? By empowering that parent with property that's now properly theirs, like that voucher, right? They now, but again, it's also it's in conjunction with, there's a certain role for the state there, but there's also the way in which the state should be harnessing that is by empowering the parent, respecting the parental rights, parental authority, et cetera, et cetera.
But that mutually reinforcing nature, and this is a great example of it, because the parents have a moral authority with their household, with their children, the way in which they spiritually and ideologically want to inform the family development, that is in their domain. It's their sovereign decision. And that works in conjunction with their economic rights. The parents, not the children, are the taxpayer, therefore have greater sovereignty over the school choice that flows out of that economic transaction. And so I think that there is a really interesting connectivity in those two issues. But you talk about the role of the state, and earlier you had said that there are parameters and boundaries we might believe in around private property. And I suppose this becomes the, I'd like to say $1,000,000 question, but I suspect it's a multi-trillion-dollar question, is where does the right of the state to interfere with private property begin and end? Is it merely in the sort of protection of private property? There's a kind of positive reinforcement, or does the state have a right to limit private property? How do we best unpack that to really create the outcome that is ideal for a free and virtuous society?
I mean, I think the short answer there is that the state's going to have to protect property rights, which means in a certain sense, you could think they're, quote, limiting property rights, but really what they're doing is they're defining what is the scope of the property right. And I'll give an example. Where I live, we don't have a municipal water system. Everyone has a well. And there's been concern where I live that there's someone who's drilling these mass industrial wells on their private property to then bottle the water and commercially sell it. But this is zoned as a residential and agricultural district. It's not zoned, for commercial water distribution. And the fear is that like the aquifer that we sit on will run dry. And so it becomes a question of whose property rights, what's the scope, what's the limit? And the state has a role of adjudicating that. And zoning's part of that, right? So if it's not zoned for commercial water excavation and then bottling and sale, because what could happen here, the risk that some of the homeowners have is, what are we supposed to do if our well runs dry, right? Do we all then have to drill another couple 100 feet down? Who then has the obligation? Are we paying for that out of our own pocket? And the wells haven't run dry for 100 years that people have been living here, but now a commercial driller, et cetera, right? So someone needs to adjudicate that. And you could say that what they're doing is that they're protecting the private property rights of the residential people, and therefore they're limiting the private property rights of the commercial guy, or they're defining the scope of the property rights, et cetera, et cetera. Another example, you could think of a residential neighborhood. Your private property right to play the music of your choice at the volume of your choice has certain limits, right? If it's midnight and you're having a raucous party, the cops might say, look, it's above a certain decibel limit, time, place, manner restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. By contrast, if you soundproof your home, you can listen to whatever you want, at whatever volume you want. It's your castle. You're the king of your castle, right? And so I think that's where the hard part comes is that, I think what the state really needs to do is define the scope of property rights and then defend those property rights, protect those property rights. Obvious limits are going to be, you can't use your property to harm other people, right? So the harm principle is going to be a limit. There might be other limits, right? And so I think what we really want to say is that justice is the moral principle. It's the virtue that's going to govern these transactions. And then what the state's role there is to defend justice, to promote justice, which entails both human rights and the common good, right? I think sometimes people want to put those things as if they're in tension. I think properly understood, they should go together.
But my concern with using the terminology of justice is that one can operate without a limiting principle to where the mere accumulation of private property is said to be unjust. And that within the justification of a justice principle, that all of a sudden things to limit one's accumulation and disposition and decision-making around property becomes somewhat random. It could become Orwellian, but again, still rationalized around common good, where the criteria you used for some of those other examples, to me, was really firm around the limit on one person's private property starts where another person's private property rights are being denied or impeded. The person with a right to play loud music, that is not limited because we're simply trying to interfere with their property rights. It's because they're interfering with someone else's property rights. And of course, deteriorating the concept of a common good. I don't expect that all these things can be simple or black and white. There's gray, there's need for adjudication. I think our founding fathers understood this. And I imagine you, as much as I, are fond of allowing a sort of subsidiarity concept to be at play here. Wherever we think the state can intervene to deal with water controversy or sound ordinances, I assume we still would believe that's best done at a city and municipal level versus Washington, D.C.
Oh yeah, my neighbors are, they're appealing to the county supervisor. That's the level of government that has jurisdiction for the land management disputes about the well drilling. The only thing I would add about, justice can at times, not be as concrete as, the specifics of a well running dry or loud music at night. Charitable giving is not the only, and I would say it's not even the primary way in which we fulfill those duties, right? I think one of the things that we've learned through the past 200 years of kind of the market revolution that's taken place is that one of the best ways in which you can assist the needy is by growing a business, creating jobs, dignified work with a dignified salary to allow people to care for themselves. I mean, I think that's, rather than being dependent, whether it's on the government or on charitable giving, the most humane way to do this is actually to grow the economic pie in such a way that it allows people to exercise their gifts, their talents, earn a living to support their family, et cetera, et cetera. So I actually think intelligent, prudent investment in businesses, in schools, and various other things might be one of the better mechanisms rather than, redistributive taxation, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, Ryan, I really thank you for your time. Your insights on the subject are incredibly important. I appreciate the balance you bring to the subject, the willingness to engage in a dimension that requires tension. And this is the thing I believe is so important for advocacy of free and virtuous society, is there is going to be a tension. And yet, reconciling those tensions does not require an abandonment of principles, either market principles or our biblical ethical commandments. I think that there is really a holistic nature to the whole counsel of God on this subject, and I'm really grateful for your work in helping us dissect it, and thank you for spending time today coming on No Free Lunch.
Yep, thank you. This is a fun discussion. We should do it again.
Absolutely. Lord Acton said that a people averse to the institution of private property are without the first elements of freedom. A low regard for private property will always lead to a low regard for freedom, because at the very outset of freedom, the freedom to worship, the freedom of speech, the freedom for human exchange, interaction, all starts with a belief in private property. And throughout history, we have seen that a deteriorated regard for property leads to a deteriorated regard for all rights. In a society that values private property, it values the optimal stewardship of such. It values the rights that have to be preserved around it and leads to a better experience for humanity. This is why private property is the assumption of economics. Thank you for watching No Free Lunch.